The December sun hung low over Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, casting long shadows across the tarmac where a C-17 Globemaster had just touched down. The air tasted of salt and jet fuel, that peculiar blend of ocean and military precision that defined this place where America's Pacific might lived and breathed. Among the deplaning passengers, one figure moved differently than the rest. She wore an olive drab flight suit, sterile and anonymous. No name tape, no rank insignia, no unit patch. Nothing to distinguish her from 1,000 other bodies in uniform, except for the way she carried herself. There was an economy to her movements, a deliberate stillness that suggested someone who understood that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal was patience. Brigadier General Eleanor Jane Cross was 40 years old, though the lines around her eyes suggested she had lived several lifetimes in those 4 decades. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe regulation bun. Her hands, calloused and steady, carried only a small duffel bag. Everything she needed for this mission could fit in that single bag. Everything except the weight she carried in her chest, the hollowness that 5 years had done nothing to fill. She cleared base security with credentials that raised eyebrows but opened doors. The security airman looked at her ID, looked at her face, looked back at the ID, and simply waved her through. No questions. There were some clearances that inspired silence rather than conversation. The bachelor officer quarters assigned to her was identical to 10,000 others across the military landscape. Spartan, functional, a bed, a desk, a locker, a window overlooking a parking lot. She set her duffel down and stood for a moment in the center of the room, letting the emptiness settle around her like an old coat. On the desk, she placed 3 items: a laptop encrypted and hardened, a stack of technical manuals on network architecture and electronic warfare, and a single-frame photograph of a mountain range snow-capped peaks against an impossibly blue sky. Anyone looking at that photograph would see a landscape. Eleanor saw the last place she had been truly happy before the phone call, before the folded flag, before everything changed. But it was the footlocker that held what mattered most. She knelt before it, entering a 6-digit code on the electronic lock. The mechanism disengaged with a soft hiss, and she lifted the lid slowly, reverently, as if opening a tomb. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, lay the relics of another life. A circular patch embroidered with exquisite detail. A phoenix rising from black flames, its wings stylized to resemble satellite antennas. Around the edge, silver threads spelled out words in Latin: fides antennas, faith in the antennas. A modern twist on an ancient motto designed for warriors who fought in a domain most people could not see. Beside the patch, a pair of dog tags on a ball chain. The metal had been worn smooth by her fingers over 5 years of handling, 5 years of holding conversations with the dead. She picked them up, let them dangle, watched the afternoon light catch the stamped letters. Cross, Sarah Mom, O, P.O.S. USF. The photograph was next. 4 people frozen in a moment before the world learned how to hurt them. A father in his army dress uniform, chest full of ribbons, arm around a woman with kind eyes and graying hair. 2 girls in front, teenagers, one 15 and serious one 12, and smiling. The serious one was Eleanor. The smiling one was Sarah. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Cross had died in Beirut in 1993 when Eleanor was 8 and Sarah was 5. A car bomb outside the Marine barracks. Her mother had died of cancer when Eleanor was 22, just after her commissioning. That left only Sarah. And then 5 years ago, the universe had taken her too. Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of Sarah's face in the photograph. Her little sister. Her best friend. Her reason for everything that came after. The final item in the footlocker was older than the rest, anachronistic in this age of digital communication. A field radio RTO model from the 1980s, heavy, bulky, capable of transmitting only voice over limited ranges. Their father had carried one in Beirut. Sarah had kept it as a memento, and when she deployed, she always took a photo of herself. With it, sent it back to Eleanor with a note, "Old school never fails." Eleanor closed her eyes and let the memory wash over her. Afghanistan, September 20, 2020. The operations center at Bagram Airfield was alive with the controlled chaos of a night shift. Major Sarah Cross, 32 years old and frighteningly competent, sat at a workstation surrounded by screens displaying network traffic, signal, intelligence, and threat assessments. Her fingers moved across 3 keyboards, simultaneously a maestro conducting an orchestra only she could hear. She had been tracking an anomaly for 6 hours, a pattern in the electromagnetic spectrum, subtle as a whisper but persistent. It matched no known friendly signature. More concerning, it matched a pattern she had seen in historical data, archived files from the Cold War era. Soviet electronic warfare doctrine adapted and updated for the 21st century. She called her supervisor over a commander with 20 years of service and the kind of confidence that came from never having been proven catastrophically wrong. "Sir, I need you to look at this." He barely glanced at her screen. "Major Cross, we've been over this. Our systems are the most advanced in the world. We have triple redundant security protocols. Whatever you're seeing is probably atmospheric interference or equipment calibration drift. Sir, this signature matches Cold War-era Soviet EW patterns. Someone is probing our network infrastructure, learning our response times, mapping our architecture." "Sarah." His voice carried the tone of a patient parent addressing a paranoid child. "The Cold War ended before you were born. The Russians aren't coming. We have real threats to focus on. Stop chasing ghosts and get back to your actual assignment." She wanted to argue, wanted to make him see what was right there in front of her, clear as daylight to anyone who knew how to read the signs. But she was a major and he was a commander, and in the military, that hierarchy meant something. "Yes, sir." She returned to her station, but she did not stop monitoring, did not stop documenting, did not stop preparing. 12 hours later, at 1500 local time, the attack came. It began as a flicker. Screens across the operations center stuttered for half a second. Then the lights. Then the backup systems. Then everything. The attack was elegant and brutal. It entered through the network's own security protocols, turning the base's defenses into weapons pointed inward. Communication satellites went dark. Radar systems displayed false targets. The power grid destabilized. In 90 seconds, one of America's most technologically advanced military installations was reduced to a blind, deaf, stumbling giant. Sarah Cross did not panic. She had been preparing for this moment since her conversation 12 hours earlier. While others shouted and typed futilely at frozen keyboards, she ran. There was a manual override station installed decades ago and never removed despite being considered obsolete. Hardened, shielded, completely isolated from the main network. It could shut down the compromised systems, cut the base's network off from the outside world, stop the attack from spreading. But it was located in a building 200 meters away, and she had approximately 3 minutes before the attack reached the base's ammunition storage network. If that happened, the resulting explosions would not be simulated. She ran through the Afghan darkness, her boots pounding against concrete, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of systems failing, generators, straining, people shouting. She reached the override station, a small bunker-like structure that smelled of dust and disuse. The door was locked. She used her sidearm to shoot the lock off, not because it was necessary, but because she did not have time for the keypad code. Inside, the manual controls were exactly where the schematics said they would be. A series of large switches, the kind with satisfying mechanical resistance, the kind that could not be hacked because they were not connected to anything digital. She began throwing switches. 1, 2, 3. The base network segments isolated, firewalled, severed from each other and from the outside world. 4, 5, 6. The compromised nodes shut down their malicious code, suddenly speaking to nothing but emptiness. 7, 8, 9. The explosion came from nowhere and everywhere. A secondary attack, a kinetic component that the digital assault had been designed to mask. A mortar round fired from outside the wire, targeted with precision at the communications hub Sarah had just isolated. The building she was in was close enough to feel the shockwave, close enough for the concussion to rupture her organs, close enough for the flying debris to do what years of war had never managed. Major Sarah Cross died, saving 217 personnel. She received a Bronze Star posthumous. Her family received a folded flag and a letter from a general who had never met her, thanking them for her sacrifice. Eleanor Cross, then a colonel stationed at the Pentagon, received a phone call at 0400 Eastern Time. She listened to the words, processed them, understood them, and something inside her, something that had been merely damaged before, finally broke completely. The memory released Eleanor back into the present. She was kneeling in her quarters at Pearl Harbor, holding her sister's dog tags, her face wet with tears. She had not realized she was crying. 5 years. 5 years of wondering if Sarah's death had mattered. 5 years of reading reports that carefully avoided saying what Eleanor knew to be true. Sarah had been right, and her superiors had been fools, and she had paid for their hubris with her life. Eleanor placed the dog tags back in the footlocker, arranged just so. She closed the lid, heard the lock engage. She stood, walked to the small bathroom, and washed her face with cold water. When she looked in the mirror, the woman staring back at her was composed again. Calm, analytical, ready. She had not come to Pearl Harbor for revenge. Revenge was a luxury she could not afford and a distraction from the mission. She had come because the same institutional disease that killed Sarah was alive and thriving, and someone needed to diagnose it, document it, and cut it out before it killed again. The Pentagon had given her a simple assignment: observe, report. Do not intervene unless absolutely necessary. Assess the human systems, not the technical ones. Find the cultural vulnerabilities that no amount of hardware upgrades could fix. She had accepted the assignment with one condition. When she found the problem, she would be allowed to make it visible, not through a report that would be filed and forgotten, but through demonstration, through consequence, through forcing people to confront what they had become. They had agreed. They had given her a new rank, at least on paper. Commander Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, a temporary assignment classified above top secret, known only to a handful of people in Washington. Everyone else on base would know only that there was a new commander, and that commander's identity was need to know. For the next 48 hours, Eleanor Cross would be nobody, a ghost in a sterile flight suit, and she would watch and wait and see who revealed themselves for what they truly were. The dining facility at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam was designated DFAC 2, a bureaucratic label for what was functionally the largest cafeteria on the installation. It hummed with the controlled chaos of the midday meal. 1,200 people eating simultaneously created a wall of sound trays, clattering conversations, overlapping the occasional burst of laughter, the distant whine of a C-17 on approach to Hickam Field. The facility was designed with function over comfort. Long rows of tables, industrial-grade chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows on the western wall that overlooked the channel separating Ford Island from the main base. Through those windows, if you sat at the right table, you could see the white structure of the USS Arizona Memorial, a silent testament to the day when this harbor had burned. Eleanor had chosen that table deliberately. It sat 4 people positioned at the exact center of the window wall, offering the best view in the house. She had been observing for 3 days now, and she had learned that this table was considered prime real estate by the base's senior officers. She had watched them claim it day after day, their entitled presumption as predictable as the tide. Today she sat there alone. She ate with deliberate slowness, making it clear she was not rushing, not leaving anytime soon. Her meal was standard DFAC fare: baked chicken breast, steamed vegetables, brown rice water. She ate because the body required fuel, not because she tasted any of it. Her mind was elsewhere, running through the exercise parameters, the network vulnerabilities she had deliberately built into the scenario, the predictable ways that overconfident commanders would fail. The DFAC doors opened with a theatrical flourish that made several people turn their heads. Rear Admiral Victor Brennan entered like a man who believed the world had been waiting for his arrival. He was 52, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that came from 3 decades of having people snap to attention when he walked into a room. His summer white uniform was immaculate, tailored to perfection. His chest was a billboard of achievement ribbons stacked high, warfare devices gleaming, the 2 stars on his shoulder boards catching the fluorescent light. He was flanked by his entourage: 2 junior officers, Lieutenants Davis and Parker, both eager and young and hungry to bask in proximity to power. Behind them, maintaining a careful professional distance, was Commander James Kalin, the Admiral's flag aide. Kalin was 38, competent and increasingly uncomfortable with the role he found himself playing. Brennan's voice carried across the DFAC, a booming baritone designed to command attention. "Gentlemen, observe. This is what happens when standards slip. Prime real estate, best view in the house occupied by..." He paused for effect, his eyes landing on Eleanor. "What is that? A maintenance technician? A supply clerk?" The lieutenants laughed on cue. Commander Kalin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that Eleanor caught and cataloged. Brennan led his procession directly toward her table. He moved like a man who had never been told no, who had confused his rank with inherent superiority. He stopped at her table, planted his hands on his hips, casting a shadow across her tray. Eleanor did not look up. She brought a forkful of rice to her mouth with unshakable steadiness, chewed, swallowed, placed the fork neatly beside her plate. Only then did she raise her eyes to meet his. Her eyes were dark, analytical, and utterly placid. They gave away nothing. They made no promises and issued no threats. They simply observed the way a scientist might observe a specimen under glass. "You're in our spot, Sergeant," Brennan said, deliberately misidentifying both her branch and her rank. The insult was calculated, designed to put her in her place through casual dismissal. Eleanor's expression did not change. She looked at him for 3 long seconds, her silence more unnerving than any retort could have been. When she spoke, her voice was low, clear, and without inflection. "This is a general dining facility. There are no reserved tables." Brennan's smile was predatory. This was what he enjoyed. A little public discipline, a small demonstration of authority, a reminder to the lower ranks about where they stood in the natural order of things. "I'm making it reserved now," he said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I'll ask you one more time out of professional courtesy. Get up and find another seat." Eleanor picked up her fork again. Her intention to resume eating was crystal clear. "I am not finished," she said. The Admiral's face flushed a deep crimson. The laughter from his aides died instantly. The nearby tables had gone quiet, all eyes on the confrontation. This was no longer about a seat. This was about something older and more primal. Authority, control, the unspoken rules that governed every interaction in the military hierarchy. "Commander Kalin," Brennan snapped, not taking his eyes off Eleanor, "have these 2 gentlemen escort this individual from my table." Lieutenant Davis and Lieutenant Parker grinned. They cracked their knuckles in a pantomime of force, a display of threatened violence that was meant to intimidate. Commander Kalin hesitated. "Admiral, perhaps we could just take the next table over. There are several available. Are you questioning my order, Commander?" The temperature in Kalin's voice dropped by 20 degrees. "No, Admiral." Kalin looked at Eleanor, a silent plea in his eyes. She ignored it. Her focus remained on her meal, on the deliberate act of finishing what she had started. Lieutenant Davis reached for her arm. "All right, let's go. Up you get." His fingers had not yet made contact when Eleanor moved. It was not a strike. It was not violence. It was biomechanics, pure and simple. As his hand approached her shoulder, she pivoted on the ball of her left foot, her body flowing around his outstretched arm like water around stone. Her left hand cupped his elbow joint, not squeezing, merely guiding. Her right hand gently redirected his wrist. She used his own forward momentum against him. A principle as old as physics, executed with the kind of precision that comes from thousands of hours of practice. Lieutenant Davis found himself spun off balance, not falling, but lurching awkwardly into Lieutenant Parker, who was moving in behind him. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. When it was over, both lieutenants were untangling themselves, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Eleanor was already seated again, her posture unchanged. She had not spilled a single drop of water from her glass. The hush in the dining facility deepened. This was not supposed to happen. Junior personnel did not touch senior officers. They certainly did not make them look foolish in front of an audience. Brennan stared, momentarily speechless. He had expected resistance, perhaps some verbal pushback that he could punish. He had not expected a lesson in applied physics delivered with the detached air of someone solving a minor engineering problem. He recovered quickly, his fury masking his astonishment. "Assault!" he roared. "You just assaulted a naval officer. I want your name and your unit right now. You are in a world of trouble." Eleanor calmly reached into the thigh pocket of her flight suit and withdrew a small black data pad. She tapped the screen, once activating it. The faint sound of the Admiral's own voice played back. "Assault, you just assaulted a naval officer." The recording played for less than 2 seconds before she silenced it. She looked up at Brennan, her face as impassive as stone. She had been recording, a receipt documenting everything that had just transpired. "My name is Cross," she said. Brennan's jaw worked. "Your rank. What is your rank?" Eleanor did not answer immediately. She held his gaze for 3 long seconds, a silent challenge that was anything but insubordinate. It was a statement of fact, an invitation for him to dig his own hole deeper. He was standing at the edge of a cliff, and she was simply watching to see if he would jump. Insubordination, Brennan snarled, his voice shaking with rage. Disrespect to a flag officer. Assault. I'll have you in the brig before sundown. He straightened to his full height, pulling rank like a weapon. I am Rear Admiral Victor Brennan, commander of Carrier Strike Group 5, Forward Deployed Element. Now you will tell me your rank, or I will have the Master-at-Arms drag you out of here in handcuffs. Eleanor simply took a slow sip of water. She set the glass down with deliberate care. Then she picked up her tray, the meal half-eaten, and stood. She walked past the stunned admiral and his cohort, past the silent watching sailors and airmen, and placed her tray on the return rack with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout. She did not look back. She moved with a quiet dignity that seemed to suck the very air out of Brennan's righteous fury, leaving him standing there, fuming and impotent, in a room that had become a monument to his public overreach. He had demanded her rank. Her silence was the loudest answer he had ever received, and he was determined to make her pay for it. Commander James Kalin walked across the manicured lawns of the headquarters complex with a profound sense of dread settling into his stomach. In his hand, he carried a datapad containing the formal complaint Admiral Brennan had dictated, reviewed and signed with a flourish that suggested he thought himself righteous. Kalin had tried to stop it, had tried to inject reason into a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond control. But the Admiral had been adamant, his ego fully invested, now his authority challenged, in front of hundreds of witnesses. The complaint was a masterpiece of curated outrage. It painted Eleanor Cross, identified only by her last name, as an aggressor, a subversive element who had instigated conflict, assaulted commissioned officers, and willfully defied lawful orders. It demanded her immediate confinement to quarters pending court-martial. Every word felt like a betrayal of Kalin's own better judgment. But the order had been direct, and he was a commander, and admirals did not accept no gracefully. The headquarters building loomed ahead, a stolid structure that housed the base's administrative heart. Somewhere in that building was the base commander's office. The new commander, whoever they were. The scuttlebutt was that the position had been filled by someone from the Pentagon, a specialist in intelligence and cyber warfare, someone whose identity was classified above the level most people on base could access. Kalin entered through the main doors, showing his ID to the security desk. He was directed to the third floor, to an outer office, where an executive assistant maintained the gatekeeper role for the base's senior leadership. Chief Master Sergeant William Davis sat behind a desk that was immaculately organized. He was 48 with steel gray hair and a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a career spent in some of the military's most demanding assignments. His eyes, sharp and assessing, looked up as Kalin entered. Commander, what can I do for you? Kalin held out the datapad. Formal complaint from Admiral Brennan. He requests immediate action. Chief Davis took the datapad, his face carefully neutral. He read the document, and Kalin watched for any reaction. There, a brief tightening around the eyes, a micro-expression that lasted perhaps half a second. Davis looked up, met Kalin's eyes, and in that moment, Kalin saw something that made his blood run cold. The chief knew something Kalin did not. The Admiral expects a prompt reply, Kalin said, feeling foolish as the words left his mouth. Chief Davis set the datapad down on his desk with deliberate care. The General's schedule is dynamic. The matter will be addressed in accordance with all applicable regulations. The General, not the Commander. The General. Kalin opened his mouth to ask, then closed it again. If the base commander's identity was classified, pushing for information would only get him escorted out by security. Thank you, Chief. He turned to leave, but Davis's voice stopped him at the door. Commander Kalin. Yes, Chief. For what it's worth, sir, your hesitation was noted and appreciated. Kalin did not know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and left. As he walked back toward the flag officer quarters, his unease grew with every step. He had just helped arm a missile, and he had a terrible feeling it was pointed directly back at them. The first move had been made. Admiral Brennan had escalated, had created his official receipt, had signed his name to it, and submitted it into evidence. The provocation was now a matter of permanent record. And somewhere in that headquarters building, someone was reading it. Someone whose identity was classified. Someone whose response would determine whether this was merely an embarrassing incident or something far, far worse. in a small office on the third floor behind a door marked only with Commander JBPHH, authorized personnel only. Eleanor Cross sat at a Spartan desk and read Admiral Brennan's complaint for the second time. Her face showed nothing. No anger, no amusement, no satisfaction. She read it the way a pathologist might read an autopsy report, noting the details, cataloging the evidence, understanding the progression of the disease. The complaint was textbook. It hit all the right bureaucratic notes, used all the proper terminology. It was also complete fiction, a document that bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually occurred. But that was not surprising. Brennan had convinced himself that his version of events was truth, because accepting anything else would require acknowledging that he had been wrong. Eleanor opened a drawer and withdrew a simple file folder. Inside were 3 other complaints from 3 other bases, from 3 other flag officers who had encountered a mysterious junior service member who had challenged their authority and then disappeared before consequences could be administered. 4 data points, 4 commanders who valued ego over competence, authority over truth, hierarchy over mission. 4 examples of the institutional cancer that had killed Sarah. She placed Brennan's complaint in the folder, aligned the edges precisely, and closed it. She stood at the window looking out at Pearl Harbor as twilight descended. Somewhere beneath those darkening waters, 1,100 sailors still stood their eternal watch aboard the Arizona. They had died because someone ignored warnings, dismissed intelligence, valued assumptions over evidence. Just like Sarah. Brennan's complaint sat in her folder, now Exhibit A, in a case he didn't yet know he was building against himself. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so tragic. A rear admiral, demanding the arrest of his own commanding officer, signed and submitted with all the righteous fury of wounded pride. "You've armed the weapon, Admiral," Eleanor murmured to the empty room. "Let's see if you're wise enough to realize it before it detonates." Tomorrow would bring the reckoning. Not revenge, she had learned long ago that revenge poisoned the avenger, but correction. Consequence. The kind of institutional accountability that might have saved Sarah if it had existed 5 years ago. Then she opened her laptop and began typing her own report. Not a rebuttal, not a defense, simply a factual account of what had occurred, time-stamped and cross-referenced with the audio-visual recording from her datapad. The report would go to Washington, to the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to the small group of people who had authorized this operation. But that was for later. First, she needed to finish what she had started. The exercise was scheduled to begin in 36 hours. Wardrum Pacific, a massive multi-domain wargame designed to test the command's ability to operate under contested conditions against a peer-level adversary. An exercise she had designed. An exercise that would replicate with eerie precision the exact scenario that had killed Sarah. And Admiral Brennan, in his arrogance, had no idea what was coming. Eleanor saved her report, closed the laptop, and looked out the window. The sun was setting over Pearl Harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In the distance, she could see the white structure of the Arizona Memorial, where 1,100 sailors still rested beneath the waves. "Tomorrow, Sarah," she whispered to the empty office. "Tomorrow they learn." She stood, smoothed her sterile flight suit, and walked out into the Hawaiian evening. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and the clock was already counting down. The Joint Operations Center existed in a state of perpetual twilight. No windows penetrated its reinforced walls. The only illumination came from hundreds of screens, casting everything in shades of blue and green, giving the massive space the feel of an aquarium where information swam instead of fish. The center was built into the heart of the headquarters complex, 3 stories tall and tiered like an amphitheater. At the lowest level, dozens of workstations formed concentric rings around a central holographic display table. Above them, on raised platforms, sat the specialized cells: intelligence, communications, air operations, naval surface warfare, cyber defense. At the very top, behind a reinforced glass, the flag bridge overlooked everything: a command perch for the admiral, who would orchestrate this carefully choreographed dance of modern warfare. It was 0545 Zulu when the first personnel began filtering in for the start of Wardrum Pacific. The exercise had been 18 months in planning, involved assets from 3 carrier strike groups, 2 Marine expeditionary units, multiple Air Force wings, and enough supporting elements to populate a small city. On paper, it was designed to test the Pacific Command's ability to coordinate operations across thousands of miles of ocean against a sophisticated near-peer adversary. In reality, it was a trap. Eleanor Cross had designed it that way. She entered the JOC at 0552, moving through the security checkpoints with credentials that raised no alarms but opened every door. She still wore the sterile flight suit, still carried no visible identification. To the handful of personnel already at their stations, she was just another body, perhaps a civilian contractor, perhaps a tech specialist from some obscure program office. She found an unused terminal in the far corner of the upper tier, a position that offered clear sight lines to both the main holographic display and the flag bridge above. She did not log into the terminal, did not touch the keyboard, just sat hands folded in her lap and watched. At 0558, Admiral Brennan arrived. He swept into the JOC with his usual entourage, his summer whites replaced now by a working uniform, but his bearing unchanged. If yesterday's confrontation in the dining facility had rattled him, he showed no sign of it. He climbed the steps to the flag bridge with the confidence of a man who believed the next 48 hours would be a masterclass in modern naval warfare, with himself as the instructor. Commander Kalin followed 3 steps behind, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that suggested he had not slept well. Lieutenant Jennifer Marshall was already at her station in the cyber warfare cell. 26 years old, blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, she had the intense focus of someone who understood that her job existed in the invisible spaces between things where battles were won or lost before the first shot was ever fired. She glanced up as the Admiral entered, caught sight of Eleanor in the corner, and her brow furrowed slightly. Recognition without understanding. Where had she seen that woman before Chief Master Sergeant Marcus Vance entered last, moving with the economical grace of a man who had spent 3 decades in the Air Force and knew every trick for conserving energy over a long shift? He was 48, graying at the temples, with eyes that missed nothing. He took his position at the senior enlisted console, and as he settled in, his gaze swept the room in a practiced pattern. When his eyes found Eleanor, they stopped, lingered. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture of puzzlement, then turned his attention to his screens. But Eleanor had seen the recognition in his face. Vance knew, or suspected. She had served with his unit before years ago, had met him in passing during an operation in Afghanistan. He would not remember her name, but he would remember the way she moved, the particular stillness she carried. And if he remembered her, he might remember who else moved that way. He might remember Sarah. At precisely 0600 Zulu, Admiral Brennan's voice boomed across the JOC. "Gentlemen, ladies, this is what we train for. Wardrome Pacific represents the most sophisticated adversary we're likely to face. They will test every system we have. They will probe for weaknesses. And we will demonstrate that American technological superiority and operational excellence make those probes futile. Let's show them what happens when you pick a fight with the Pacific Fleet. Operations you have control. Execute Phase 1. The holographic display flickered to life in the center of the room. A 3-dimensional representation of the Pacific Theater materialized, stretching from Hawaii to the Philippines. Friendly forces appeared as blue icons: carrier strike groups, surface action groups, submarine patrol areas, air wings distributed across a dozen bases. The opposing force designated OPFOR appeared and read their positions based on intelligence estimates and electronic signatures. Phase 1 was simple: establish network integrity, confirm sensor coverage, validate communication pathways. Kindergarten stuff for a command this sophisticated. The operators began their calls. Air warfare sensors green across the board. Surface plot, all tracks correlated and identified. SATCOM primary and backup 5x5. Cyber defense, all nodes secure, no anomalous activity. The efficiency was beautiful to watch. 200 people working in synchronized harmony, each playing their part in a machine designed to project American power across the world's largest ocean. Eleanor watched the screens, her eyes moving in a pattern that would have looked random to anyone who did not know what she was seeing. She was not watching the friendly forces. She was watching the network traffic monitors, the bandwidth utilization graphs, the latency indicators that flickered in small windows at the edges of the main displays. There, a spike in latency from USS Valley Forge, barely noticeable. 0.03 seconds, well within normal parameters, gone almost before it registered. She began counting. 12, 11, 10. At the cyber warfare station, Lieutenant Marshall frowned at her screen. That's odd, she muttered to herself. Her supervisor, a lieutenant commander named Patterson, glanced over. What is Valley Forge just had a micro dropout. Data link flickered. Back now, but the position data was off by about 300 meters for a second. Patterson shrugged. Sensor calibration, have them run a diagnostic. Yes, sir. But Marshall's frown did not go away. She made a note in her log, highlighted it, flagged it for review. Something about that flicker bothered her in a way she could not articulate. 15 minutes into Phase 1, the F-35 squadron designated Reaper flight reported intermittent telemetry. Their IFF transponders were cycling on and off, creating brief moments where the fighters disappeared from the display before reappearing. The Air Warfare Coordinator called it up to the flag bridge. Sir, Reaper flight is experiencing data link instability. They report all aircraft systems nominal on their end. Brennan barely glanced at the report. Atmospheric propagation. They're flying through a weather cell. Not a concern. Have them continue mission. Commander Kalin shifted uncomfortably. Admiral, these symptoms are similar to T. Commander, I need you focused on the exercise, not on phantom patterns. Brennan's tone was dismissive but not quite harsh. A reminder of hierarchy wrapped in professional courtesy. Kalin fell silent, but his eyes went to his tablet, to a document he had been reviewing for most of the night. An after-action report from September 2020, written by Major Sarah M. Cross, analyzing an electronic warfare attack on Bagram Airfield. In that report, Sarah had described the early warning signs of a sophisticated infiltration, micro dropouts, sensor anomalies, latency spikes that appeared random, but followed a pattern if you knew how to look. Kalin had stayed up until Doro 300 reading that report. Now watching the exercise unfold, he felt a cold certainty settling into his bones. This was not coincidence. This was a rerun. Chief Vance saw it too. He pulled up network diagnostics that most people in the room would not have known how to access tools from his decades of experience managing communications infrastructure. What he saw made his jaw tighten. The anomalies were not random. They were probing, testing, learning. He glanced across the room at Eleanor. She sat perfectly still, her face showing nothing, but her eyes were tracking the same data he was. She knew. She understood what was happening, and she was doing nothing to stop it. The realization hit Vance like a physical blow. She was not here to participate. She was here to observe, to watch, to see what would happen when the system was stressed. At 0630, Zulu, 28 minutes into the exercise, the attack truly began. It did not announce itself with alarms or flashing red lights. It began with a whisper, a subtle wrongness that crept through the network like fog. Lieutenant Morrison, a young ensign at the primary C4I console, was the first to notice something beyond routine anomalies. His screen showed network traffic patterns, thousands of data packets flowing between nodes every second. The patterns should have been relatively stable, a controlled chaos with recognizable rhythms. Instead, it was shifting. The data flows were changing shape, adapting, doing things that defensive systems should have been preventing. Sir, I'm seeing unusual packet behavior on the command net. His voice was uncertain, not wanting to sound alarms over what might be nothing. The watch officer came over, looked at Morrison's screen, frowned. Define unusual. The traffic pattern is, I don't know how to describe it, it's like it's learning. Watch this segment here. He highlighted a data flow. Our filters should be catching this and dropping it, but it's mutating faster than the filters can update. It's like it knows what we're going to do before we do it. Before the watch officer could respond, three things happened simultaneously. USS Valley Forge disappeared from the holographic display. Not flickered. Disappeared. Vanished as if it had never existed. The entire Reaper flight data links went dark. 8 F-35s, $40 million each, reduced to blank spaces on the screen. And every alarm in the JOC began screaming at once. The transformation was instantaneous. The calm, controlled environment erupted into organized panic. Operators shouted over each other. Screens filled with error messages. The holographic display, which moments before had shown a clean tactical picture, dissolved into a chaos of flickering icons, false contacts, and corrupted data. What the hell is happening? Brennan's voice cut through the noise, not panicked, but sharp with command authority. Morrison's hands flew across his keyboard, his training taking over even as his higher brain functions struggled to process what he was seeing. Massive electronic warfare attack. Admiral, the network is collapsing. We're losing data integrity across all domains. Where is it coming from? I don't know, sir. It's everywhere. It's like our own IFF signals that are turning hostile, attacking us from inside the network. Brennan gripped the railing of the flag bridge. Isolate the corrupted nodes. Reboot primary systems. Get me back my tactical picture. We're trying, sir, but another operator's voice joined the chorus. Sir, every time we identify a malicious waveform and attempt to filter it, it changes. It's polymorphic. It's adapting faster than we can counter. This was beyond anything they had trained for. This was beyond anything the playbooks covered. The opposing force was not just jamming them, it was turning their own network into a weapon using the complexity of their systems against them. The intelligence cell suddenly stood up, and the terror in the officer's voice silenced the room for a heartbeat. Admiral Priority 1 Flash, automated launch detection from Site Omega-3, inbound ballistic missile signatures, projected impact, Pearl Harbor in 12 minutes. Time seemed to slow. Every person in the JOC felt it, that terrible moment when training and reality collide, and the brain has to decide which is which. Site Omega was a designated launch facility for the exercise, a simulated adversary position that could generate false signatures for training purposes. But the signatures appearing on the screens did not look simulated. They looked real. 3 missiles inbound, 12 minutes to impact. And with the network compromised, with every system unreliable, there was no way to verify whether those signatures were part of the exercise or something horrifyingly actual. Brennan's face went pale. Verify those signatures. Get me Stratcom. Get me NORAD. I need confirmation. Is this exercise or is this real? The watch officer was already reaching for the phone, but Morrison stopped him with a shout. Sir, all primary and secondary communications are down. The attack is targeting our satellite uplinks. We're deaf. We're blind. Then get me a landline into PA-COM. Landlines are compromised too, sir. We're getting loop data echoes of our own queries. Nothing is getting through. The JOC had descended into a maelstrom. The operators were typing furiously, trying everything they knew, everything they had been taught, and achieving nothing. The network was fighting them. Every input they made seemed to make things worse. The holographic display was now a storm of red hostile tracks appearing and disappearing, friendly forces ghosting in and out of existence. The 12-minute clock appeared on every screen, large and unavoidable, counting down toward an impact that might be simulated or might be the end of everything they were sworn to protect. Brennan stood frozen, his expertise in carrier aviation and surface warfare utterly useless in this new kind of battle. He was a master of kinetics of steel and fire and physics, you could see. This spectral warfare, this invisible enemy that attacked through code and electrons, was beyond his comprehension. Commander Kalin watched his admiral, watched the man who had been so confident just minutes before now, paralyzed by a threat he could not understand. Kalin looked down at his tablet at Sarah Cross's report still open on the screen. She had written about this exact scenario, had warned about it, had died trying to prevent it. And somewhere in this room, someone else knew. Kalin's eyes found Eleanor in her corner. She had not moved, had not reacted to the chaos. She sat with the stillness of stone, her eyes tracking the screens, taking in every detail of the collapse, with an expression that was not surprise or fear. It was evaluation. Clinical. Detached. She had been waiting for this. The clock showed 10 minutes remaining. Lieutenant Marshall was on the verge of panic, her training warring with the reality that nothing she had learned was working. She had tried every protocol, every defensive measure, and the attack adapted around each attempt. It was like fighting smoke. Sir, I need help, her voice cracked. I can't stop it. It's anticipating every move. Chief Vance heard the desperation in Marshall's voice. He saw the same thing in a dozen other faces around the room. People on the edge of breaking their confidence, shattered their training, revealed as inadequate. He turned in his chair, his eyes finding Eleanor again. She met his gaze across the room, and something passed between them. A moment of understanding between two professionals who had seen real war, real consequence, and knew the difference between disaster and training. Vance made a decision. He stood and his voice carried across the JOC with the authority of 30 years of service. Admiral Brennan, sir, I respectfully suggest you allow General Cross to assist. The effect was electric. Every head in the room turned, not to Vance, but following his gesture toward the woman in the corner, who no one had paid attention to. Brennan's face contorted with rage and confusion. What are you talking about, Chief? Who is General Cross? But Eleanor was already standing. She moved with that same deliberate economy of motion, walking down the tiered levels toward the main floor. Each step was measured unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world instead of 9 minutes before simulated Armageddon. Lieutenant Davis, one of the officers from the dining facility, stepped into her path. Ma'am, you can't be down here. This is a restricted... Eleanor did not slow, did not acknowledge him. Her voice cut through his protest like a blade through silk. Move. It was not a request. It was not negotiation. It was command, absolute and undeniable, carrying an authority that had nothing to do with the invisible rank she wore and everything to do with the certainty in her voice. Davis moved. Eleanor reached Morrison's console. The young ensign was trembling, his face pale, his eyes wide with the knowledge that he was failing and people might die because of it. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and her voice softened just slightly. Breathe, you're not failing. You're chasing ghosts. Step aside. Morrison moved without question, and Eleanor slid into his seat. From the flag bridge, Brennan's voice was nearly a roar. Someone explain to me what is happening. Who authorized that civilian to access my C4I console? Chief Vance remained standing, his posture at attention, his voice respectful but immovable. Sir, that is Brigadier General Eleanor Cross, United States Air Force. She is the architect of this exercise. And right now, she is the only person in this room who knows how to save us. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. 8 minutes remained on the clock. Eleanor's fingers touched the keyboard, and it was like watching a different species interact with technology. Her hands moved with absolute precision. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She was not typing in the desperate, frantic way of the other operators. She was conducting each keystroke deliberate and purposeful. Lieutenant Marshall, still at her nearby station, watched in awe as Eleanor bypassed the graphical interface, entirely dropping directly into the system's core command line. Streams of code appeared on the screen, raw hexadecimal, that looked like gibberish to anyone who had not spent years living in the guts of network architecture. Lieutenant Marshall, Eleanor said without looking away from her screen, spectral analysis of the noise floor, 24 to 58 gigahertz range. I need it now. Marshall's hands moved before her brain fully processed the request. Ma'am, the system is compromised. I can't access a voice command protocol gamma, authorization code Oracle. The system responded. Marshall's screen populated with a complex waveform analysis that she had not even known the system could produce. To her eyes, it looked like static random noise. But Eleanor was nodding her eyes, scanning the patterns with the focus of someone reading a language only she understood. There, Eleanor said more to herself than anyone else. Not a direct attack. Parasitic. It's riding the latency residuals between our network nodes. Her fingers resumed their dance across the keyboard. She was not fighting the attack, was not trying to block it or filter it. She was doing something else entirely, writing new code in real-time, building something from scratch in the middle of the crisis. It's not in the system, she explained, her voice calm and instructional, a teacher in the middle of a masterclass. It's in the echoes between the system, the spaces where data moves from one node to another. That's where it lives. Marshall watched the code scroll by her technical training, allowing her to parse about 30% of what she was seeing. You're not blocking it, you're making it louder. The signal is frequency hopping, but the latency signature is constant. It has to call home, has to report back to its controller. We can't see the weapon, but we can see the chain it's pulling on. The waveform on Marshall's screen began to resolve. 3 distinct patterns emerged from the chaos, triangulating to a single point deep in the Pacific Ocean, a location that should have been empty water. There, Eleanor's finger touched the screen. Source, simulated adversary submarine controlling the electronic warfare platform. Commander Kalin, who had descended from the flag bridge to watch, saw the solution taking shape. We can't target it. Our targeting data is routed through the compromised network. We'd be firing at our own ships. Eleanor's eyes moved to the wall, scanning, finding what she was looking for. A small panel that most people in the room had probably never noticed, labeled in faded stencil, Emergency Telegraphy Circuit. She stood and walked to it. The entire Geoke watched her move the chaos, momentarily forgotten, as everyone tried to understand what they were witnessing. "That's 1940s technology," Morrison whispered. Eleanor opened the panel. Inside was a simple system, almost primitive by modern standards. A hardened copper landline, shielded and isolated, running directly to the Naval Communication Station at Wahiawa, 15 miles away. It was too slow for data, too simple for modern warfare, which made it perfect. Eleanor toggled the activation switch. A green light flickered on. She lifted the microphone, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and precise. "This is Oracle. Execute fire mission Trident Dagger. Target coordinates follow." She read off the numbers her algorithm had derived, speaking them clearly enough that a human on the other end could write them down and relay them through channels that existed outside the compromised network. "Authentication Phoenix Alpha Niner." Morrison gasped audibly. "Oracle, that's the exercise architect. That's the person who designed all of this." The room had gone silent except for Eleanor's voice. Even the alarm seemed quieter, as if the machines themselves were listening. On the holographic display, a single clean icon appeared. USS Cheyenne, a Los Angeles-class submarine that had been running silent throughout the exercise, waiting for exactly this moment. A thin yellow line extended from its position toward the coordinates Eleanor had provided. 6 seconds later, a red X appeared over the source location, and everything changed. The ghosting icon stabilized. The false missile signatures vanished as if they had never existed. The data links to Reaper flight reestablished themselves. The network, starved of its controller, rebooted and returned to stable operation. The red alarm strobes shut off. The Geoke returned to its normal blue twilight. The clock stopped at 1 minute and 17 seconds remaining. Eleanor stepped back from the telegraph panel. She looked at the main display, at the tactical picture that was now clean and clear, showing friendly forces exactly where they should be. No threats, no chaos. Then she turned and looked up at the flag bridge at Admiral Brennan, who stood gripping the railing with white knuckles. Her expression had not changed. Still calm, still analytical, still waiting. But now everyone in the room understood what they were looking at. The silence was absolute. 200 people, trained professionals, all sat frozen in their seats. They were not looking at the displays anymore. They were looking at Eleanor, and then slowly their gazes shifted upward to Admiral Brennan. The Admiral's face had gone through several colors in the past 4 minutes. Red with anger, white with fear. Now it was settling into a gray pallor, the color of a man who had just watched his entire worldview collapse. His mind was working, processing, making connections he should have made days ago. Oracle, Phoenix Alpha Niner. Code words from the deepest, most classified portions of the exercise plan. Words that only the exercise director would know. The person who had designed this scenario, who had built every aspect of it, who had authority superseding normal command structures for the duration of the war game, and he had filed a formal complaint against her, accused her of assault and insubordination, tried to have her arrested. Commander Kalin was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Admiral, the complaint." Brennan could not respond. His mouth opened, but no words came. He just stared down at Eleanor, who stared back with those same dark, analytical eyes. The screens around the room began populating with automated reports. The after-action review system had already compiled the incident into a comprehensive document, time-stamped and detailed. Every operator's action, every failed attempt, every second of the crisis, all captured for analysis. And at the top of the AAR, in bold text, "Exercise restored by operator callsign Oracle utilizing manual override protocol. Restoration time 4 minutes 43 seconds. Lieutenant Marshall read the report on her screen, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the technical analysis. She wrote a counter polymorphic algorithm in real time. I've never seen anyone do that. It would take a team of analysts hours to develop something like this, and she did it in under 3 minutes. Chief Vance approached Eleanor, maintaining a respectful distance. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only those nearby could hear. "Sarah would be proud, ma'am." Eleanor's composure cracked for just a moment. A brief tightening around her eyes, a shallow breath. Then it was gone, the mask back in place. She shouldn't have had to die to prove she was right, Chief. No, ma'am, she shouldn't have. The main doors to the JOC opened, and Chief Master Sergeant William Davis entered carrying a sealed envelope. He climbed the steps to the flag bridge, his face carefully neutral, and handed the envelope to Admiral Brennan. Sir, you are summoned to a board of inquiry. Tomorrow morning, 0900 hours. Brennan took the envelope with shaking hands. A board of inquiry on what grounds? The convening authority is classified, sir. That's all I'm authorized to say. Davis turned and left, and Brennan stared at the envelope as if it were a live snake. Eleanor remained on the operations floor, accepting quiet congratulations from operators who were beginning to process what they had witnessed. Lieutenant Marshall approached hesitantly, and Eleanor turned to face her. Ma'am, that was incredible. Where did you learn to do that? From my sister, Eleanor said. She taught me that polymorphic attacks have a heartbeat. You just have to know how to listen for it. Your sister was in cyber warfare. Eleanor's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. Major Sarah Cross. She gave her life stopping an attack her commanders refused to believe was coming. Afghanistan 2020. Marshall's face went pale. I know that name. We studied her case at the schoolhouse. She's a legend in the cyber warfare community. You're her sister. I am. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. She would have been proud of what you just did. Eleanor nodded once, then returned to her corner terminal. She opened her laptop and began documenting typing with the same precision she had shown at the C4I console. She was recording everything while the details were fresh, building the official record that would become part of the permanent archive. Around her, the JOC slowly returned to normal operations. The exercise continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The confidence that had filled the room at the start of the shift was gone, replaced by a humbled awareness of how quickly things could go wrong and how little their sophisticated systems mattered when the fundamentals failed. Admiral Brennan remained on the flag bridge, staring at nothing. Commander Kalin stood beside him, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. Finally, Brennan's voice emerged hoarse and small. I didn't know. No, sir, you didn't ask. Brennan looked at his flag aide, and for the first time in Kalin's memory, the Admiral looked old, tired, diminished. I filed a complaint against the exercise director, against a general officer, against the woman who just saved my command from complete failure. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you know what they're going to do to me? Kalin thought about the answer carefully. Sir, I think that depends on what you learn from this. Brennan nodded slowly, still staring at the envelope in his hands. Get me everything you can find on Major Sarah Cross. I want to know who she was. What happened to her? I want to understand. Yes, sir. As the shift progressed toward its end, Eleanor finished her documentation and closed her laptop. She looked around the JOC one final time, cataloging the faces, the reactions, the lessons learned, and lessons still waiting to be understood. Her eyes found Chief Vance, and she gave him a small nod. He returned it, a moment of understanding between two people who had both served with Sarah, who both knew what it meant to lose someone to institutional arrogance. Then Eleanor stood, picked up her laptop, and walked toward the exit. Every person she passed stopped working, turned to watch her leave. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. The door closed behind her and the spell broke. The JOC erupted into conversation, but it was different now. Not the casual chatter of before. This was processing debriefing, people trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant for everything they thought they knew. Outside in the humid Hawaiian evening, Eleanor walked across the base toward her quarters. The sun had set while she had been in the JOC, and the base was settling into its nighttime rhythm. Aircraft warning lights blinked in the distance. The sound of the ocean was a constant murmur beneath everything else. She had done what she came to do, had demonstrated the vulnerability, had proven that expertise mattered more than rank, that humility was more valuable than confidence, that the quietest voice in the room might be the one worth hearing. Tomorrow would bring consequences. The Board of Inquiry would convene, and Admiral Brennan would face the full weight of what he had done. His career would probably end, or at least be permanently altered. But that was not the point. It had never been about destroying one man. It was about changing a system that had killed Sarah and would kill others if left unchecked. Eleanor entered her quarters, set her laptop on the desk, and opened the footlocker one more time. She lifted out Sarah's dog tags, held them in her hand, felt the worn metal against her palm. "I did it, sissy," she whispered to the empty room. They listened. Finally, they listened. And for the first time in 5 years, Leonore Cross allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Sarah's death had not been meaningless after all. The night deepened over Pearl Harbor, and in offices across the base, people began preparing for the reckoning that dawn would bring. The VTC suite on the third floor of the headquarters building was designed for gravity. Heavy oak table, high-back chairs, soundproofing that created a silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. On the far wall, a screen large enough to make the people on the other end feel present, as if they could reach through and touch you. At 08:55, Commander James Kalin arrived, his uniform pressed to perfection, his face betraying nothing of the sleepless night he had endured. He took his seat on the left side of the table, opened his tablet, and waited. At 08:57, Admiral Victor Brennan entered. He had aged a decade overnight. The swagger was gone. The confidence that had defined him for 30 years had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that authority and competence were not the same thing. He sat at the center of the table, folded his hands in front of him, and stared at the dark screen. At 08:59, Eleanor Cross walked in. She still wore a flight suit, but not the sterile one from the past 3 days. This uniform bore proper insignia. On her collar, a single silver star gleamed under the fluorescent lights. On her left shoulder, the phoenix patch with its stylized antenna wings. On her right chest, ribbons told the story of a career spent in places and operations most people would never know existed. She carried only a single datapad. She took the seat at the far end of the table, placed the datapad in front of her with precise care, and raised her eyes to meet Brennan's. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, not as an obstacle or an irritant, but as what she was. A flag officer, a warrior who had spent 2 decades mastering a domain he barely understood. A woman who had lost her sister to the exact kind of institutional arrogance he had displayed. "General Cross," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Eleanor's expression did not change. "You owe me nothing, Admiral. You owe an apology to every officer who has ever been dismissed because someone in authority confused their rank with wisdom. But we can discuss that later. Right now we wait." When at precisely 0900, the screen activated. 3 faces appeared arranged in a formal triangular composition. In the center, Vice Admiral Patricia Moreno, 57, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen everything the Navy could throw at a person and had emerged harder for it. To her left, Rear Admiral Thomas Fletcher, 55, a submariner with the quiet intensity of someone who had spent half his life in tight spaces under the ocean. To her right, Rear Admiral Sarah Williams, 52, Air Force, a career intelligence officer with a reputation for seeing through bullshit at 1,000 yards. Vice Admiral Moreno's voice filled the room, carrying the weight of institutional authority. "This Board of Inquiry is now in session. The purpose of this hearing is to review the events of the last 72 hours concerning Exercise Wardrome Pacific and a formal complaint filed by Rear Admiral Victor Brennan. Let the record show that all parties are present and that this proceeding's being recorded." She paused, letting the formality settle. Then her eyes, sharp and unforgiving, focused on Brennan. "Admiral Brennan, I have before me 2 documents. The first is the after-action review from the Joint Operations Center event designated Spectral Cascade. The second is your formal complaint against an individual you identified only as Cross. On the surface, these 2 documents appear to describe 2 very different people. Let us clarify who we are discussing." Her gaze shifted to Eleanor. "Ma'am, for the record, please state your full name, rank, and current assignment." Eleanor stood. The movement was unhurried, almost ceremonial. Commander Kalin, watching from his seat, felt his breath catch. This was the moment. The institutional correction was beginning. Admiral Brennan's hands clenched into fists below the table knuckles white. Eleanor leaned slightly toward the microphone embedded in the table. Her voice was calm, steady, filling the silent room with the same authority she had shown in the JOC. "Brigadier General Eleanor Jane Cross, United States Air Force. Serial number withheld for security purposes. Current duty assignment is Special Assistant to the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for Strategic Integration. Temporary assigned role for the Operation Designated Red Cell Charlie 7, Commander Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. The words landed with the impact of artillery shells. Kalen closed his eyes briefly. Base commander. She was the base commander. Brennan made a sound somewhere between a groan and a gasp. The blood drained from his face so quickly that for a moment Kalen thought the admiral might actually faint. Vice Admiral Moreno allowed the silence to extend, let the weight of the revelation press down on everyone in the room. When she spoke again, her voice carried an edge of carefully controlled anger. Thank you, General Cross. Let the record show that General Cross has been operating under Red Cell Observation Protocol Alpha, an assessment program authorized directly by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The purpose of this protocol is to evaluate command climate and decision-making from the bottom up with the observer's identity classified at the highest levels. This protocol exists because we have identified systemic problems in how our flag officers lead, particularly in their treatment of subordinates and in their response to challenges to their authority. She let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Admiral Brennan, your complaint alleges that General Cross, whom you identified as a sergeant and assumed to be enlisted personnel, assaulted two of your junior officers, willfully disobeyed a lawful order, and displayed conduct unbecoming. You demanded her immediate arrest and confinement to quarters pending court-martial. Is this accurate? Brennan's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Yes, ma'am. And approximately 11 hours after you filed this complaint, General Cross prevented the simulated catastrophic failure of your command during Exercise Wardrum Pacific, utilizing expertise that none of your staff possessed, ultimately saving the exercise and providing a masterclass in crisis management. Is this also accurate? Yes, ma'am. Rear Admiral Williams leaned forward, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been sympathy, but was more likely contempt. Admiral Brennan, help me understand your thought process. You encountered a service member in an unmarked uniform. A uniform that, had you taken even a moment to consider it, should have raised questions. Sterile flight suits are typically worn by personnel operating in sensitive programs, special operations, or command positions where identity protection is paramount. Did you at any point consider why this individual might be dressed that way? Brennan swallowed hard. No, ma'am, I did not. You encountered resistance to what you perceived as a lawful order. This individual refused to vacate a table in the general dining facility because, and I quote from the audio recording, "This is a general dining facility. There are no reserved tables." This was a factually accurate statement. The individual was correct. You were wrong. Did you consider that perhaps your order was not in fact lawful? No, ma'am. You then ordered two of your junior officers to physically remove this individual. When they attempted to do so, she utilized a minimal force redirection technique consistent with de-escalation training that resulted in no injuries to anyone involved. You characterized this as assault. Did you consider that perhaps your officers were the aggressors in this situation? No, ma'am, I did not. Rear Admiral Fletcher spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who chose his words with care. Admiral Brennan, I have reviewed your service record. 30 years of exemplary performance, multiple combat deployments, commendations from 3 different fleet commanders. By every objective measure, you are a successful naval officer. So help me understand how an officer of your experience could make such a catastrophic error in judgment. Brennan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was raw with something that might have been genuine self-awareness. Sir, I saw a woman in a plain uniform sitting at a table I wanted. I saw someone I perceived as junior, as beneath my notice, refusing to defer to my authority. And I reacted not as an officer, not as a leader, but as someone whose ego had been challenged. I did not think, I did not question. I simply assumed that my rank gave me the right to do what I did. He paused, gathering himself. And I was wrong, completely unforgivably wrong. I had no right to that table. I had no right to order that officer to move. And when I was corrected, instead of accepting it with a grace, I doubled down. I weaponized the system, filed a false complaint, and attempted to use my authority to punish someone for the crime of being right when I was wrong. Vice Admiral Moreno nodded slowly. At least you are honest about it now. General Cross, do you have evidence you wish to present regarding the initial encounter? Eleanor tapped her data pad once. The audio recording played crystal clear, capturing every word of the exchange in the dining facility. Brennan's voice dismissive and contemptuous. The lieutenant's mocking tones, Eleanor's calm refusal. The escalation that Brennan had initiated and then blamed on her. When it finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Rear Admiral Williams spoke again. General Cross's datapad also contains a detailed log of the entire incident, including video footage from 3 different angles. The logs show that at no point did General Cross initiate physical contact. At no point did she use excessive force. At no point did she behave in any manner inconsistent with proper conduct for a commissioned officer. The same cannot be said for you, Admiral Brennan, or for the 2 officers acting under your orders. Vice Admiral Moreno leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Brennan's face. This board finds that there was no assault. There was no insubordination. There was no conduct unbecoming. What there was, Admiral, was a clear abuse of rank and authority. You created a public spectacle designed to humiliate a fellow service member. You filed a false official report against a flag officer, and you did all of this because your ego could not tolerate being told no. She let that sink in before continuing. However, this board also acknowledges your performance during the crisis in the JOC. When confronted with a situation beyond your expertise, you did eventually defer to General Cross's knowledge. You allowed her to work without interference. That deference likely prevented actual catastrophe, even though the exercise was simulated. It shows that you are capable of putting mission above ego, even if it took a crisis to force you to do so. Brennan nodded slowly, accepting the judgment. Vice Admiral Moreno's voice hardened. Nevertheless, the findings of this board are as follows. Rear Admiral Victor Brennan, you are hereby relieved of command of Carrier Strike Group 5 Forward Deployed Element, effective immediately. You will return to Washington for reassignment. Your new assignment will be to the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, as an instructor. Your specific duty will be to develop and teach a curriculum on integrated warfare, with particular emphasis on humility and leadership and the importance of expertise over hierarchy. Brennan's face showed no surprise. He had known this was coming. Yes, ma'am. You will also undergo 6 months of training with General Cross's team, learning the fundamentals of cyber warfare and electronic combat. Not because we expect you to become an expert, but because we expect you to understand your limitations and to recognize expertise when you encounter it. Yes, ma'am. Commander Kalin, Moreno's attention shifted. You attempted to restrain your admiral's worst impulses. You showed moral courage in questioning his decisions even when it put you at risk. This board commends you for that. You are promoted to captain effective immediately with assignment to General Cross's Red Cell program. Congratulations, Captain. Kalin stood stunned. Thank you, ma'am. Lieutenant Jennifer Marshall, who is not present but whose actions are part of the record. She demonstrated initiative and technical competence during the crisis. Recommend her for early promotion to Lieutenant Commander. General Cross, do you concur? Eleanor spoke for the first time since her initial identification. I concur. Lieutenant Marshall has significant potential. She will do well in the cyber warfare community. Vice Admiral Moreno nodded, then her expression shifted slightly, becoming less formal and more personal. General Cross, this board is aware that you have conducted 4 other Red Cell operations in the past year. In each case, you have identified flag officers who prioritized ego over mission effectiveness. This is the 5th. The pattern is disturbing and speaks to a cultural problem within our senior leadership. Rear Admiral Williams added, we have authorized a new training program mandatory for all officers at 06 and above. It will be called the Sarah Cross Protocol, named in honor of your sister, Major Sarah M. Cross, who died attempting to prevent an electronic warfare attack because her commanders would not listen to her warnings. Eleanor's composure cracked. Just slightly, just for a moment. Her eyes glistened, and she blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that 5 years of grief had not fully released. Thank you, she said quietly. Sarah would have appreciated that. Vice Admiral Moreno's voice softened. Your sister was right, General. She saw clearly, she spoke bravely, and she died honorably. This protocol will ensure that her sacrifice was not in vain. No officer will die again because someone in authority was too arrogant to listen. The screen showed images now pulled from classified files. Sarah Cross in uniform smiling at the camera. Her service record. Her final after-action report the one that had predicted her own death with eerie accuracy. Her grave at Arlington, where she rested alongside their father and hundreds of thousands of other warriors who had given everything. Eleanor stared at the image of her sister's face, and the room waited in respectful silence. Finally, Vice Admiral Moreno spoke again. "This board is adjourned. Admiral Brennan, you are dismissed to arrange your travel. Captain Kalin, you will report to General Cross for further assignment. General Cross, you have our deepest gratitude for your service and for your sister's sacrifice." That is all. The screen went dark. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Brennan stood, walked around the table to where Eleanor sat, and came to attention. He rendered a salute crisp and perfect, the way he had been taught as a midshipman 40 years ago. "Permission to speak, General." Eleanor returned the salute and nodded. "I read everything I could find about your sister last night. She was extraordinary, brilliant, and she was failed by people like me, people who thought their experience and their rank meant they knew better. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot bring her back. But I swear to you, on what remains of my career, I will spend the rest of my service making sure no one forgets her name or the lesson she tried to teach us." Eleanor studied his face, looking for insincerity and finding none. "Admiral Brennan, my sister did not die for revenge. She died so that others might live. You can honor her by teaching what you have learned. Teach them that silence is not weakness. Teach them that questions are not insubordination. Teach them that the quietest voice in the room might be the one worth hearing most." "I will, General. I promise you that." Eleanor extended her hand. Brennan shook it, and in that moment something passed between them. Not friendship, but mutual respect. The acknowledgement that both of them had been changed by the past 72 hours, and that change, however painful, was necessary. Brennan left, and Eleanor and Kalin were alone in the room. General Kalin said, "I want to apologize as well. I should have done more to stop him." "Captain, you did exactly what you should have done. You raised concerns. You documented your objections. When he overruled you, you followed orders while maintaining your integrity. That is all anyone can ask." "Still, I feel like I failed." Eleanor's voice was gentle. "You did not fail. You were caught in an impossible situation, and you handled it with honor. That is why you are being promoted and reassigned. We need officers like you, officers who understand that loyalty to the mission is more important than loyalty to any individual commander." Kalin nodded slowly. "What happens now?" Now, Eleanor looked out the window at Pearl Harbor, at the water that had burned 84 years ago and had become sacred ground. "Now we continue the work. There are more red cell operations to conduct, more flag officers who need to be tested, more cultural problems to identify and correct. The Sarah Cross Protocol is just the beginning. Will it work? Will this actually change anything?" Eleanor considered the question. "I do not know. Culture changes slowly and institutions resist change. But I have to believe that it matters. I have to believe that Sarah's death and the deaths of everyone else who has been failed by bad leadership can mean something if we are willing to do the hard work of reform." She stood gathering her datapad. "Welcome to the team, Captain. Get some rest. We deploy in 3 days to evaluate a 3-star general in Stuttgart. He has a reputation for ignoring his intelligence staff. Let us see if that reputation is earned." Kalin stood and saluted. "Yes, ma'am, and General, thank you for what you are doing, for keeping Sarah's memory alive." Eleanor returned the salute. "She was my sister, Captain. Keeping her memory alive is not duty, it is love." The next morning, Eleanor returned to the Joint Operations Center. This time when she entered, she wore her proper uniform. The single star on her collar caught the light. The phoenix patch on her shoulder seemed to shimmer in the blue glow of the screens. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped. Personnel turned to look. And then, without any order being given, people began to stand. It started with Chief Master Sergeant Vance. He rose from his console, came to attention, and rendered a crisp salute. The gesture rippled outward like a wave. Lieutenant Morrison stood. Lieutenant Marshall stood. The watch officers, the intelligence analysts, the communications specialists, the cyber warfare operators. One by one, rank by rank, every person in the JOC rose to their feet. 200 salutes offered simultaneously, creating a forest of raised hands. Eleanor stood at the entrance and felt the weight of it. Not just the respect, though, that was present, but the acknowledgement, the understanding that something had changed, that a lesson had been learned, that the culture of this command would never be quite the same. She returned the salute, a single gesture that encompassed everyone in the room. Captain Kalin appeared at her side, and Chief Vance approached from the operations floor. In Vance's hands was a freshly pressed flight suit, olive drab and immaculate. On the collar, the single star was pinned with exact precision. On the left shoulder, the Phoenix patch had been attached with the kind of care that spoke of reverence. "General," Vance said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent JOC, "thought you might want the proper uniform now that the observation phase has concluded." "Welcome back to the light, ma'am." Eleanor took the flight suit, held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the symbol. "Thank you, Chief, for everything, for remembering Sarah, for understanding what this was about. She saved my team in 2019, ma'am. I owe the Cross family a debt I can never repay, but I can make sure her name is remembered with honor. We all can." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The personnel in the JOC remained at attention until she gave a slight gesture permission to return to their duties. They sat, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a focused intensity now, a sense of purpose that had been missing before. They had seen what happened when ego eclipsed competence. They had seen the cost of not listening. They would not forget. 1 week later, Eleanor sat at the same table in the dining facility where this had all begun. The table by the window overlooking the USS Arizona Memorial. But this time she was not alone. Lieutenant Marshall sat to her left, discussing improvements to the cyber defense protocols. Captain Kalin sat across from her, reviewing the mission brief for Stuttgart. Chief Vance walked by with 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of Eleanor without being asked. "Black, no sugar, ma'am." "You remembered from 2010, Chief. Never forget the coffee order of an officer who saved my life, ma'am." Other officers approached the table, but now they did so respectfully, asking permission before joining rather than demanding the seats as their right. Eleanor welcomed them, and conversations flowed about operations, about lessons learned, about ways to improve. The DFAC was fuller than usual, and Eleanor realized why. Word had spread. This was the table where a general had sat in silence while an admiral had made a fool of himself. This was the table where the confrontation had begun that had changed everything. People wanted to see it, to be part of the story. Lieutenant Marshall's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then looked up at Eleanor with concern. "General, we have a situation, South China Sea. Naval intelligence is detecting cyber anomalies in the regional network. Pattern analysis suggests it is similar to what we saw in Wardroom Pacific." Eleanor set down her coffee. "Real or exercise?" "Unknown, ma'am. But given the geopolitical situation, we are treating it as real until proven otherwise." Eleanor stood, and immediately the officers around her stood as well. "Assemble the team. Briefing room 3 in 20 minutes. Captain Kalin, notify PACOM that we are spinning up a response. Chief, get me a secure line to the Pentagon. This goes to the top immediately." "Yes, ma'am." As Eleanor walked toward the exit, she paused and looked back at the table at the window, at the white structure of the memorial visible in the distance. She touched the Phoenix patch on her shoulder, a gesture that had become habit, a way of bringing Sarah with her into whatever came next. "Still here, sissy," she whispered. "Still fighting." 6 months later, the Sarah Cross Cyber Warfare Training Center was dedicated at Fort Meade, Maryland. The ceremony was attended by senior officers from all services, by members of Congress, and by family members of those who had been lost to the same kind of institutional failures that had killed Sarah. Eleanor stood on the stage looking out at the crowd and saw Admiral Brennan in the back. He was in civilian clothes, now retired as of 3 weeks ago, but he had come anyway. He caught her eye and nodded a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. The memorial at the center of the facility was simple. A black granite wall with Sarah's name at the top, and beneath it the names of 17 other service members who had died because their warnings had been ignored. Their expertise dismissed, their voices silenced by those who should have listened. Vice Admiral Moreno gave the keynote address. "We gather here to remember those who saw clearly, who spoke bravely, and who paid the ultimate price for truths that made their leaders uncomfortable." Major Sarah Cross warned her command about an electronic warfare attack. She was dismissed as paranoid. She was told to stop chasing ghosts. And when the attack came exactly as she predicted, she gave her life-saving others. Moreno paused, and in that silence, Eleanor heard the wind through the trees, the distant sound of training exercises, the rhythm of an installation that never slept. The Sarah Cross Protocol exists now in every service. It gives junior officers the authority and the protection to challenge decisions they believe are wrong. It requires senior officers to listen to genuinely consider expertise regardless of rank, and to accept that being wrong is not a failure of leadership. Refusing to learn from being wrong is the failure. Eleanor stepped forward to unveil the memorial. She pulled the cord and the cover fell away, revealing the names carved into stone. Sarah's name gleamed at the top letters, deep and permanent, a promise that she would not be forgotten. Sarah, Eleanor said, speaking to her sister and to the crowd and to the future all at once. You tried to save them. You spoke truth when it was dangerous. You gave everything so that others might live. We remember, we honor, we learn. This facility, these protocols, this commitment to listening, to valuing expertise over ego, this is your legacy, and we will carry it forward today and always. She planted an oak tree beside the memorial, young and strong, and built to last centuries. Its roots would go deep into this ground, and its branches would shelter generations of warriors who would learn what Sarah had tried to teach. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Brennan approached. He had lost weight, looked older, but there was something different in his eyes. Clarity, perhaps, or peace, Umbramas. General Cross, Admiral Brennan, I heard about your retirement. What will you do now? I've been asked to consult for the Naval War College, developing the new leadership curriculum. He paused, meeting her eyes. My first lecture is titled, The Officer at the Table When Authority Silences Expertise. I use our encounter as the primary case study. Every student who passes through that course will know Sarah's name. They'll understand exactly what happens when ego eclipses competence. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, the word was too simple, but recognition. This man had been refined by fire, and he was choosing to carry forward what he'd learned. That's more than I hoped for, Admiral. Sarah would approve. Brennan looked at the memorial at Sarah's name. I think about her often, about what she might have accomplished if she had been listened to, about how many others like her we have lost because men like me were too arrogant to see our own limitations. She would tell you that regret is useless unless it changes behavior. You are changing behavior, yours and others. That matters. I hope so, General. I truly hope so. They stood together in silence, two warriors who had come to understanding through pain, who had learned that the hardest battles were not fought with weapons, but with the courage to admit when you were wrong. As Brennan walked away, Eleanor remained at the memorial. She traced Sarah's name with her fingertips, feeling the carved letters, the permanence of stone. We did it, Sissy. They are listening now. Finally, they are listening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Eleanor stood there until the light faded and the stars began to emerge, countless points of light in the darkness. Silent stars shining not for glory, but simply because it was their nature to shine. Just like Sarah. Just like all the others whose names were carved into the wall. They had shone brightly briefly, and their light continued even after they were gone, guiding others through the darkness. Eleanor touched the phoenix patch one final time, then turned and walked back toward the headquarters building. There was work to do. There would always be work to do. But now that work had meaning. Now it was not just about preventing disaster. It was about honoring those who had tried to prevent disaster and had paid for it with their lives. Mission over ego, team over self, truth over rank. The Cross family code had become something larger now. It was America's code, carved into stone, taught in classrooms, lived in operations centers around the world. And somewhere beyond the stars, Eleanor believed Sarah was watching. And finally, after 5 long years, she was smiling. The work would never end. Excellence required eternal vigilance, and cultural change was measured in generations, not days. But the direction was set. The course was true. And every officer who passed through the Sarah Cross Training Center, who learned the protocols that bore her name, who understood that rank was responsibility rather than privilege, they would carry that light forward into the future. Into the darkness, into whatever battles awaited. Silent stars shining bright, showing the way home.